Today on WSGF Radio, we're reviewing the soundtrack to Hyper Light Drifter. Hyper Light Drifter is an action RPG inspired by the Nintendo classic The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game offers an overland world with tiered terrain much like A Link to the Past, including plenty of shrubbery to mow down. The pixelated art style invokes a retro aesthetic, with the color palette heavily reminding me of the 16-color CGA standard from the early 80s, particularly from the heavy use of cyan and magenta. Additionally, the image that iTunes uses for the soundtrack even reminds me of Graham from the old-school King's Quest series. The image of the drifter sitting by a campfire looks like Graham camping out during one of his adventures with his hat sitting next to him. What can I say? I'm an old gamer. The playstyle of Hyper Light Drifter is a mix of exploration and action, with the cool dash function used to cross small gaps in the terrain. The usage of the dash function is key to exploring the world and uncovering hidden areas and items. The game offers absolutely no dialogue, with NPCs using storyboard-like images to communicate. The world, lore, and the entire mood of the game rest solely on the game's visual style and the unique soundtrack by Disasterpeace. Before we dive into the audio, let's start with the vinyl itself. The Hyper Light Drifter 4 vinyl set from I Am 8-Bit. We have some artwork here from the game, pixelated artwork. There's a magnetic clasp here, or catch, for the front flap. We open it up. We have the 28 tracks track listing, showing that it's the soundtrack from Disasterpeace. This opens up here. We have the copyright information. The album art is by Alex Preston and Drew Wise. Heart Machine and Hyper Light Drifter are pending trademarks. I Am 8-Bit website, and then a few icons down there. We have some shiny, glossy, and matte finishes here. Again, more pixelated graphics. The center box here lifts off. It's not hinged. A flat black interior, very reminiscent of the black sleeves here. This is the sticker from the shrink wrap originally. So sides A and B are going to be a translucent pink, very see-through on this one here. Again, not much in the way of graphics on the label there. C and D is a translucent blue, though not quite as see-through as the pink. Disc 3, which is sides E and F, is a translucent green. And then finally, sides G and H is going to be a translucent red. Again, not quite as see-through as the pink, but definitely not opaque. So we will close everything back up here. Again, it's 4 vinyls, 180 gram weight, the 4 colors, pink, blue, green, and red. Put the lid back on. Again, we have the sticker here from the shrink wrap. My review steps are to listen to the soundtrack prior to playing the game, experiencing the soundtrack with the game, and then going back to the soundtrack by itself. Given that the 28 songs clock in at 2 hours and 19 minutes, this took some time. I listened to the digital download of the soundtrack in my car, which proved to create some difficulties. The soundtrack is a mix of piano, digital synth, and digital sound effects. These elements are combined to create an overall ambient soundscape of relatively low volume, which is punctuated by contrasting instrumentation and synth, often at a much higher volume. The higher volumes often carry a timbre that sounds like a microphone being overdriven, not the warm overdrive or pure distortion found in common guitar effects, but the sound of a horn instrument being overplayed or a mic with the gain set too high. Upon first hearing this timbre, I thought something was shorted or blown in my car stereo. It wasn't until I double-checked by listening to something else that I confirmed it was the intended sound. I still double-checked on additional devices and sources to ensure that my download wasn't somehow corrupted. You can hear an example of this on the very first track, Vignette, Panacea. The audio in the context of the game itself wasn't jarring, as there are visual clues to correlate with the sound, but the audio alone was jarring on first listen. The other issue I had when listening in the car was the wide range of volume dynamics found within each song and between songs. Much of the audio in each track is quiet, so much so that while in the car I had to turn up the volume in the quiet passages to overcome the road noise. This resulted in me having to turn the volume down during the volume swells or instrumental stabs. You can see the range of dynamics in and between each track, which I dumped into Apple GarageBand here. I either had to ride the volume knob while I was listening, or simply miss out on the quieter parts, which are crucial to the soundscape. While my issues were present while driving, I think that they would also be an issue while listening in any noisy or urban outdoor environment. Even while listening in my quiet home office, the dynamic range impacted my listening experience. The dynamic range also showed itself while I was playing Hyperlight Drifter. I ended up mitigating some of the impact by turning the audio down and turning up the sound effects. I simply offset the quieter audio parts of the soundtrack with other in-game audio. Now, all of this isn't to say I don't like the soundtrack. I do. Disaster Piece has created a complex soundscape that all at once conveys an otherworldliness, a bleakness, an eeriness, a futuristic, possibly dystopian, space opera vibe with retro sensibilities and influences, all on an epic scale, that yet somehow also feels very singular and very intimate. The second track, Vignette Visions, is used in the opening cutscene to great effect to tell the story of Hyperlight Drifter as seen and heard here. Tracks like The Midnight Wood, and Cult of the Zealous show some obvious influences from the 8-bit and 16-bit Zelda games without being a copycat and without taking you out of the world of Hyperlight Drifter. The Resonant Canyon, and The Last General, remind me of the 1998 Circle of Dust album Disengaged by industrial artist Clayton Scott, aka Cell Dweller, particularly his tracks Tholcandra and Paralandra. Both of these song titles are references to planets in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy novels, this being the C.S. Lewis of Narnia fame. Acropolis Falls starts off pretty mellow, and then intensifies into a solid groove at about the 2-minute mark. A Chorus of Tongues is similarly mellow, while the Hermit evokes a metallic and mechanical soundscape. The tape hiss, for lack of a better descriptor, in the piano in Panacea remind me of the Prince track Condition of the Heart from the Prince and the Revolution album Around the World in a Day. This is probably due to the fact that I've been a massive Prince fan for ages, and a lot of music simply ends up being callbacks to Prince tunes in my head. In playing the game, I found that the music perfectly suited the world, the art style, and the gameplay, which is fortunate given the responsibility the soundtrack has in carrying the game's emotional weight without any supporting dialogue, text, or any sort of exposition. As noted earlier, I had issues with the audio dynamic range and the need to ride the volume knob on my keyboard during gameplay. But I believe that this sparseness and intensity are both intentional parts of the soundscape and game design. The game itself gives you no solid direction or story. As the drifter, you are an outsider in every way, and the sound design helps to reinforce that. I liked Hyper Light Drifter well enough, though I do prefer my games with more story and direction. I played on easy as I always do, if only to lessen the combat difficulty and the grind. A good story is core to my gameplay desires as a gamer in my mid-40s, and I simply wanted more from Hyper Light Drifter in this area. In the end, I like the soundtrack better than the game itself, though going back to the soundtrack by itself really doesn't invoke any real connection to the gameplay. I enjoyed my time with the game, but it didn't stick with me when I stepped away from it. It is something that I can enjoy in short doses when I have a little free time, and I can see it probably growing on me over time, but it's just not the primary gaming experience I'm looking for. The music is phenomenal, and it really got me thinking about the role of a soundtrack in visual and multimedia. After some Googling on the differences between a soundtrack and a score, I'd actually call this the score to Hyper Light Drifter rather than the soundtrack. It consists not only of just original instrumental music composed for the game, but it also includes other sound cues and effects. It may be splitting hairs and/or semantics, but I think score is a better descriptor. To me, the term score better carries the appropriate weight of the audio and the sound design etched into these 4 LPs. In conclusion, I will say that the Hyperlight Drifter soundtrack isn't something I can see myself listening to by itself. While the music really is amazing, it often creates a tension and an unease that I don't enjoy on its own. Though I did find it oddly appropriate for long drives at night. Maybe it was simply that tension and unease that kept me aware of the road and awake. However, I can see it serving as a soundtrack to a sci-fi, cyberpunk, or otherworldly themed RPG or board game session. I can see it being a great backdrop for an RPG like Monty Cook's Numenera, or Genesis from Fantasy Flight, or any number of Cthulhu-themed games. It also works great as a soundtrack to the solitaire dice and worker placement tabletop game Deep Space D6. The vinyl release was a limited edition from I Am 8-Bit. It's now trending at about $225 on Discogs and eBay. It's available as a digital download on iTunes and Amazon for about $10. If you own the game on Steam, the soundtrack is a $5 DLC there. It's also available for $5 direct from Disaster Piece on his Bandcamp site. His website and the Bandcamp are linked below in the description. I've also linked a great article about the recording of Hyperlight Drifter from usgamer.net. Disaster Piece has a ton of music on his Bandcamp, along with a monthly subscription that gives you access to everything for $5 a month, and he's also on Spotify. Whatever you do, don't pirate the tunes. Go out and support great music, great composers, and great artists legally. This has been WSGF Radio, and we'll see you on the next spin.